This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are
created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
From WDET in Detroit, this is Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm in the studio with Carrie Jr. II, our producer. So, Carrie, one of my favorite places in the city of Detroit is the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts. And my favorite space in the whole city is inside the DIA. It's Rivera Court, this center court in the museum with a big skylight overhead that Diego Rivera was hired to paint frescoes in all the way around the space, all over the walls. And it is a celebration of the relationship of this city with its industrial past. And the detail, the color, the depth of these images has always spoken to me from the time I was a little kid. That museum, the idea of that museum is so important to us and so important to our culture. But today on the show, we want to talk about something that museums have been doing, and maybe even the DIA has been doing, that is not okay. That a lot of the things on display in these museums are things that were stolen from the people who were here on all of this land before the United States was founded.
Yeah, and today we are going to have a conversation with a former curator who really explored the balance between that field of curating and anthropology and what it means to those native tribes to have those items on display. I mean, across the country, there are museums that are starting to take down specifically Native American and indigenous remains and belongings because there is a law that was enacted in 1990 called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that outlined procedures for museums to return those belongings back to those tribes. But a lot of museums haven't been in compliance with that. So last fall, they updated that to kind of speed up the process. And so now we're seeing museums, including the DIA, who have been starting to take down some of those Native American, some of those artifacts.
And we should be clear, this is not just artifacts, things from these cultures. This is
people,
human remains in many cases that were taken for whatever reason and used for nefarious science, used for gaudy display. I mean, things that were just never really appropriate. And so the idea of trying to return these things is also trying to repair, I think, a lot of that damage that was done by not just the theft of those items, but the things that were done with them by the museums.
Yeah. Chip Colwell is going to join us on the show. He is the founding editor-in-chief of Sapiens, which is a digital magazine for anthropological thought and discoveries. He was the senior curator of anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science for 12 years. And during that time, he had to go through the process of repatriating their artifacts, the remains and belongings at that museum to Native American tribes. And so he details in his book called Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits what it was like to have to identify the tribes and in that really uncomfortable space he had to come to terms with about his science and his field and what that meant for the legacy of Native American people.
Chip Colwell, it's really great to have you here with us on Created Equal. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So I just want to start with, I guess, a confession on my part. I didn't know that this topic of repatriation was an issue. And I have to be honest, reading about it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I'm shocked by the things that I learned. I just want to give you a chance to talk about what this is and how this conflict between the field of anthropology and the dignity and history of Native tribes is playing out in some of our museums.
Definitely this topic, this crisis for many Native communities and museums can come as a surprise to many. I think museums have done a very good job of keeping their skeletons literally in the closet
In the
for a
closet,
long time.
right.
Museums are beloved, trusted institutions, often in our communities. And it's often because we don't ask where all of the things that we see on display came from.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deeper history of these institutions? And there is a really deep, profoundly unsettling history to museums and archaeology and the field of anthropology and where these collections often come from. And, you can kind of look at the starting point at different moments in history, but I go all the way back to Plymouth Rock, where the Pilgrims landed in 1620, and they arrived in this so-called New World, unsure of where they were, who the native peoples that they were amidst, and they were in those first few weeks they were desperate for food, and they were looking around native communities that had been abandoned, that they fled presumably because they saw these strangers coming, and they came across some graves. And rather than just leaving them alone, they actually dug them up out of curiosity and then took away with them, as they said, sundry of the prettiest things. So this curiosity, and what seems to be a kind of innocent curiosity of native peoples and their graves, goes all the way back to the very first arrival of Europeans, essentially, in North America.
Right.
And in the centuries that followed, native peoples continued to be this object of curiosity and literally objectified, turned into museum objects eventually, and then scientific objects. And this collecting fever really took off in the 1800s when scientists began to focus on constructions of race, and they thought that they could determine different kinds of characteristics of personality and of the races by measuring and looking at the skull.
Yeah.
So in the 1800s, the skull was collected by many museums and scholars, and what we think of as modern notions of race largely came from this misguided science. And then by the early 1900s, museums fully take off. You have the world fairs, and a lot of different nations wanted these national museums. And that just fed this belief that people could just take more and more from native peoples, but they were doing it often without their consent, without their permission, often actually in violation of their wishes. We have many cases that I talk about in my book where scientists come in and they start to dig up graves. Native peoples ask them to stop, beg them to stop, but they were legally and politically powerless to stop these scientists ravaging their history and heritage.
Yeah.
And so you get to the point where by 1990, in the late 20th century, that you have hundreds of thousands of Native American skeletons in museums, as well as millions of grave goods, as well as tens of thousands of sacred objects, religious objects, communally owned objects that had been stolen and pillaged over the centuries.
Yeah. These are in museums, which I think is also interesting. Number one, because of the gaze that is possible in museums, right? The looking onto or at objects that goes on there. But also because museums have such scientific sort of inquiry kind of at their heart. Can you talk about the role of these artifacts, these remains, in the museum world? The kind of currency, I guess, that they have, both as display and then as science.
It's fascinating because that museological gaze, the way in which museum visitors look upon the things that they see, that's very much a cultural construction, and it has shifted through the decades. So when museums were first collecting native remains and ancestral bodies and their belongings in the 1800s, it really was built around this kind of race science. And when people would see a skull, they would see a race. And really the race was a proxy for intelligence, for moral character. And it was a way to denigrate some people, meaning mostly brown and black people, and elevate people who were perceived to be white, right? So it was this hierarchical construction.
Yeah, I want to pause right there.
Yeah.
At a time in our history, you would go to a museum and see skulls on display, and it would identify them as different races, and you were to draw conclusions about the intelligence of the people by the size or the shape of those skulls?
Exactly, yeah. Those two factors. So the size, it was presumed the bigger the head, the smarter the person was, which we now know is faulty science for the most part. And also they would look at like the shape and bumps of particular points in the skull, which also determined, they thought, different kinds of personality traits. So honesty, good faith, loyalty, those sorts of things, it was presumed could be determined from the, bump here, a divot there.
Yeah. So go ahead and
yeah.
and
And so that was largely, the beginning of that kind of gaze. And then ironically, by the 1800s, as native peoples in the United States reached their nadir, you only had about 250,000 native peoples left by 1890 at the end of the so-called Indian Wars. There became this fascination of native peoples as this romantic, fading culture that actually now needed to be preserved and needed to be protected now that it was on the cusp of eradication. And so you begin to see, for example, in the World's Fair in Chicago in 1890, native peoples presented in a very romantic sense, and their arts and their culture was something to be admired. There began to be this interior decorating trend called Indian corners, where people collected pottery and blankets and things like that and put it in the corner of their room. So now suddenly native peoples were seen as something beautiful and to be cherished and protected, now that conveniently most of their lands had been taken, and that it seemed like they were going to ride off into the sunset. And so a big boom in collecting happens in this kind of romantic mode. And that's where a lot of museums began to collect things. And then by the early 1900s, you really have science with a capital S taking over a lot of natural history museums. And now native peoples' things are being excavated and collected to tell a story, to decipher their history. And so now the lens that people are coming to native culture and museums is largely through the lens of history and science. And indeed, there's all of those lenses have a kind of interesting point, from I think an objective standpoint, that yes, native things can be beautiful. Yes, you can learn from history and culture of native peoples through their things. But the point was, all of this happened for decades and decades without the consent and participation of native peoples themselves.
Yes.
So they were literally turned into objects of study of that gaze without their participation. And so that became a profoundly politically charged problem that finally came to head in the 1960s.
Yeah. When we talk about the acquisition of these artifacts and these remains, you've said that it's without the consent of the people to whom they belonged, but how does that happen? I mean, you gave some examples of people just kind of going and digging things up and taking them. How do museums get involved in it? It's not museum staff who are doing that, correct? Why does this end up in these big places that we all like to visit?
I think, so I was a museum curator for 12 years at a natural history museum in Denver. And I think people might have a perception that every object comes to us, with care and intention and thoughtfulness. The reality is we're kind of the, the junk room in a community, or the store. It's like, we all probably have closets in our home where you kind of just stuff the stuff. Yeah, it, right? Exactly. Right. And that's kind of the museum in a lot of cases. So, things definitely, most major naturalist museums do come in through some scientific, careful study and excavations, for example. others, through intentional, planned collecting expeditions. But a lot comes in from, grandma's attic, and someone in the community says, "I don't know what to do with this," and a curator says, "That looks cool." We've literally had skulls at our museum left on the doorsteps in the middle of the night.
Wow.
We infamously had a skeletal foot that one of our curators in a different department purchased at a yard sale in 1978.
My goodness.
So, it's a true mishmash, a really cacophony of items that come through so many different routes: collecting, donation, trade. A lot of museums trade items back and forth, like, hey, we need something from this period, you have something from that period, let's exchange, to fill in so-called gaps. So things are just coming in every which way. And, now most museums have much more intentional practices. Typically only about 1% of a museum's collection is actually on display. So that means in every museum you go to, there's probably a massive storage room somewhere where you have all of these things that are kept. And most museums don't have room anymore. It's very expensive given our current standards and so on. So today, museums are for the most part, much more intentional. But historically, some museums, like the big ones, you can end up with literally millions of things that come from every which way.
Yeah. And how do the museums decide about display versus science? What about these artifacts, drives that distinction, I guess, that gets made about where things go?
A lot of it is determined by the goals of a particular exhibit, a curatorial vision for what a curator wants museum visitors to take away. But it's actually, it ties really into this history, because for a long time, what got people through the door was the macabre, the curious, the fantastical, the truly beautiful. And so, museums would every museum needed a mummy, because people love mummies, right?
Right. I have to say that was my favorite exhibit at the Detroit Institute of Arts when I was a
You're
kid.
not alone.
Yeah.
You are not alone. And in the book I talk about this is not me judging other people at all, because I talk in the book about how I grew up with a love for archaeology. And when you grow up in a culture in which we lionize museums and there's nothing wrong with stealing someone's body and putting it on display, you don't think twice about it. So, I'm very much a part of the milieu in which we all are, right? That these things seem okay. And until you really stop and ask, where did they come from? Whose ancestor is this? And do the living descendants today care? What do they say? Most of us just aren't asking those questions. We're just along for the ride and enjoying it.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Chip Colwell about native artifacts and remains and the effort to repatriate some of those items. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. We're back with more from WDET in Detroit. This is Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson, and today we're talking with Chip Colwell. He's the founding editor-in-chief of Sapiens, an online magazine about anthropological thinking and discoveries. He was the senior curator of anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science for 12 years. We're talking about the idea of repatriating some of the remains and other objects from native communities that museums have in their possession. Chip, I want to start this section of the conversation talking about your experience. You arrive at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science in 2007. Tell me about the state of its collection of indigenous items at that point, and I guess what reaction you had to the state of that collection.
I arrived in 2007 at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, pretty naive to the realities of what it would take to actually do this work in repatriation, the return of ancestral human remains and their belongings to tribes.
Mm-hmm.
I had at that point gone through myself a series of crises to determine I wanted to do this work. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, loved history, had amazing teachers that got me really into Native American culture. I started going out on archaeology digs in my teens. I set up a lab. My chemistry teacher helped me set up a lab to study animal bones in high school still. I loved it. And I didn't realize until later, in a very harsh way, how what I saw as my love of Native history, Native peoples themselves saw as a form of appropriation and theft and harm. And so when I came to this understanding, I really struggled with how I could continue in this work. And eventually what I realized was perhaps I could do best by trying to be a bridge between those who do love Native history and culture and want to help and protect it and understand it, and Native cultures that see it as a form of violation. So I came to the job in 2007 hoping to be that bridge or be a part of that movement of bridging those worlds. And the museum in Denver at that point was out of compliance with a federal law that affects repatriation, that puts repatriation in place, the return of these items and ancestors to tribes. And so it was kind of you're thrown into the fire, and you just have to start somewhere. And luckily, I had an amazing set of colleagues at the museum all the way up and down the institution that were really committed to getting us right and getting us not only in line with the law, but also to embrace the spirit of it, to understand that this wasn't just a rote bureaucratic responsibility, but this was a form of justice, that we could actually try to repair past wrongs by doing things right today. So we worked really hard, and within about a year, we were able to get the museum back in compliance with the law. And then we really turned to, okay, now that we're doing the bare minimum, what can we do to actually take the responsibility of history on our shoulders and try to set it right?
And eventually, you come to a rather, certain conclusion about what's going on. I mean, so certain that the title of the book that you published in 2017 is "Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits." I mean, that's such a powerful, such a powerful phrase. There's no ambiguity there about about how you feel about what was done. Talk about that journey from 2007 to 2017.
Yes. I think it's when you really get into each particular case. So the way it works is museums inventory their collections, they notify tribes of what they have, and then tribes have the ability to claim those items from the museum. And then the museum decides if those claims are valid and then to return the items or not. So this is the framework under this 1990 federal law that all museums that receive federal funding are subject to. And when you get, so you need to look at every individual case. And some of these cases are so unsettling, horrifying even, that you begin to understand what Native communities have suffered so horribly for decades. So this, in one part of the book, I talk about a scalp, a part of someone's head that was stolen from an Arapaho chief during a massacre in 1864 in eastern Colorado called the Sand Creek Massacre. And this was just a terrifying event in which the U.S. Army murdered hundreds of Arapaho and Cheyenne people. And they then took body parts from the victims and paraded them through Denver. And then these items, these body parts, ended up in museum collections and people's personal collections, and many more just disappeared. We never we never learned the fate of them. But one of those scalps ended up at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And there simply is no humane explanation for why this happened or why a museum would continue to hold a human scalp taken from a murder victim. In another case, that I talk about in the book, there are religious items that belong to the Zuni people. So it's a tribe, a Pueblo tribe in northwestern New Mexico. These are wooden sculptures that they call ahayuda, or often it's translated as war gods or keepers of the sky in English. And these are placed at shrines around the periphery of the traditional lands to protect the people. And from the Zuni perspective, these aren't wood sculptures or pieces of art. They are literally living gods. They breathe life into these beings so that they can serve the people. And these lived at unprotected shrines all around the Pueblo. And you read the cases, and it's just one after one, they're being plucked away, just stolen.
Taken.
And it became, just they're unprotected. White people come in, think they're fascinating, and just take them. They just take them. And at one point, Zunis were starving because of different federal policies. They literally didn't have enough to eat. And a collector from the Brooklyn Museum comes in and convinces people to just turn over all of their religious items, and he's going to give them money so that they can eat. So he uses this just crisis, a famine, to manipulate Zunis into stealing their own history and selling it just so they can survive. So when you learn about these kinds of cases, for me, that's the foundation. That's the starting point to understand how violated Native peoples have been over the decades, and the ways in which we in the museum world, society at large, needs to come to terms with this history, recognize it, to acknowledge what we've done to Native communities so that we can try to set things right.
Yeah. So there's a passage in the introduction to the book where you talk about the way that you saw things when you were younger and got to the Denver Museum. You say, "For me, bones are no different from shards of pottery to be pieced back together into beautiful vases." Is that a kind of writ large way of thinking of the way that these museums approached these items, that they were just science or art?
Very much so. I mean, that is the secular, scientific with a capital S, profane way of seeing these things. And, to me, one of the most fascinating and troubling cases that I talk about in the book is precisely the ways in which human bones, human remains, can be either seen as merely, pieces of a scientific puzzle that we can put together, because you can learn amazing things from human remains. You can learn about what people ate, where they lived, their ancestry. You can look at diseases. You can look at wear and tear on the bones to understand what kind of activities they participated in. Our bodies are maps of our histories and identities. And the science can use those to understand who people were and the larger human story. And that's not to be discounted. But what's to say is that not everyone shares that view. When it's your ancestor, when it's your grandmother or your great-great-great-grandfather, you have something different at stake. And so these are two different worldviews that clash in fundamental ways when it comes to the questions of collection and return and what should happen. So what that passage in the book was pointing to was that culture clash and the ways in which this isn't merely a legal question. This isn't merely a historical question. This is a question of how different people see the world so differently. Is this an ancestor, or is this a scientific tool?
Right.
Is this a piece of wood, or is this a living God? It's precisely that knot that we untangle in the work of repatriation.
Yeah. And here, one of the challenges clearly is that it was easy in some ways to dismiss the humanity of these items because as a nation, we dismiss the humanity of these people. I mean, you couldn't do this, I wouldn't imagine, with Irish immigrants or with the remains of German settlers or, anything like that. I mean, there would be a natural pushback to that I feel like was absent here.
That's precisely the case. And what's important to understand is the ways in which the United States and other nations codified the objectification of Native peoples. And in the book, I tell the story of how Iowa became one of the first states to protect Native Americans, not only in life, but in death. And in brief, the story is a new highway was being constructed. Archaeologists are called out. They find several dozen graves. The archaeologists determine that all of the graves belong to white settlers, except for one Native woman. And all of the white graves are excavated because they're going to be destroyed by the highway, and they're immediately reburied, immediately taken to a new cemetery and buried because the archaeologists say they're white. The one Native woman, only because she's Native, her remains are boxed up and taken to the State Museum. And so here you have one place, all these people live together. They're actually all part of the same community, all from the 1800s. And the one woman was treated differently only because archaeologists said she was Native. And so she becomes a museum object, and all of the white people go back into a grave for eternal rest. So when a Native woman, she was actually not even an activist, she was just, her husband was working on the highway project, learned of this. Her name was Maria Pearson. She single-handedly went to the governor of Iowa and convinced him about the wrongness of this law under Iowa that made Native peoples archaeological objects.
Wow. And
she and the governor, over the course of a number of years, created a law that actually protected Native peoples and their remains and their belongings. And so Iowa became the first state to give equal protections to Native peoples in life and in death.
Yeah. Okay, we need to take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Chip Colwell about repatriation of remains and other artifacts from Native peoples in our country. Stay where you are. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and this hour we're talking about the idea of trying to repatriate remains and other artifacts from Native peoples that were taken from them and often held by museums. Our guest is Chip Colwell. He is the founding editor-in-chief of Sapiens, which is an online magazine about anthropological thinking and discoveries. He was the senior curator of anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science for 12 years. Chip, I want to talk more about the work here of trying to fix this. I think there's a lot of obvious complication that would be involved, but it seems that the first would be properly identifying these items or these remains and trying to figure out where they belong. I don't imagine that there's a lot of paperwork, for instance, that says where much of this comes from. So where do you even start?
That is one of the hardest parts of doing this work, and one of the most tangled elements of this federal law that we have that provides a framework for returns is, what are these items? Who gets to decide what these items are? Who are the descendants of the people who are in museums or their belongings? And then who gets them back? Who's the right descendant to receive them? And who gets to decide then what happens? And the way the law works is it requires all the parties to work on a case-by-case basis. So you take a particular item or a particular set of remains, and you do the best you can to understand its history, where it came from. You're right. When you get that skull that showed up one night on a museum's doorstep, there's not a lot of paperwork to go along with it. So oftentimes we don't have a lot of information. And then, even in cases where, say, something was scientifically excavated or collected, we may not have easy connections that we can make, across thousands of years of time sometimes between an ancestral remain and people today who might take stewardship responsibilities for it. So, sometimes the case can be quite clear. Like I was talking about with the Arapaho chief, where that scalp that was in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science it was very clear where it came from. We had the history. It literally said an Arapaho chief, in the archives. And so the Arapaho tribe is a federally recognized tribe. The only complication there is, where then do you put it? Where does a tribe put these ancestors? And it's a huge burden to ask tribes to put it on their own land, right? Because then you're basically asking them to create cemeteries, land that they can never use themselves ever again, when they're not the ones that created this mess, but they have to take responsibility for it. So in that case, the remains went to a national park that has been set up to honor and remember the Sand Creek Massacre. But many other tribes don't have such easy solutions. So sometimes you can have items where it's very clear where they came from, who they belong to, but we don't have an easy solution of where to put them back, how to respectfully put them somewhere and where they'll be protected forever. In other cases, you might know where the remains came from, but there's not an obvious descendant group today.
That was what I was going to ask. I mean, how much of these civilizations that we have been busy destroying for hundreds of years are still even intact enough to receive these things?
It's variable. This is the reality of the history of colonialism in the United States and the genocide against Native peoples, where millions of Native peoples were destroyed culturally or physically through warfare and other kinds of forms of violence. So in the book, I dedicate a whole section to a tribe in Florida that was known as the Calusa. And they were a very widespread, powerful group when the Spaniards first arrived in Florida in the 1500s. But by the mid-1700s, there weren't many left. And a lot of people say, scholars say, the Calusa went extinct in the 1700s. But other living tribes like the Seminole and Miccosukee in southern Florida say that the Calusa were incorporated into their groups. And so that, and those federally recognized tribes today are the appropriate stewards of those ancestors. So those kinds of debates then, just have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes you can find solutions. Other times museums and tribes argue, and sometimes end up these ancestors and their belongings end up in a state of purgatory for decades because no one can come to a resolution. So, it's estimated there were, in 1990, when this federal law was passed to affect repatriation, there were probably about 200,000 Native American remains in U.S. museums. That's not even including all the remains outside the United States, but about 200,000. And now, 34 years later, only about 40% have been returned.
Wow.
So that gives you a sense of just how long and difficult the process has been. And some of that has been because it's not a perfect law, as you'd imagine. And some changes have recently been made that might accelerate the process. But at the end of the day, it's been extremely difficult for museums to work with tribes and try to be responsible and accountable for these really terrible histories at times.
So if it's not possible in every case to repatriate these things to the nation or the culture that created them, is there another just way to deal with these things? In other words, to get them out of the state that they're in these museums, and find, I guess, a better, more morally acceptable place for them. What would that look like?
For me, the moral line in the sand is consent. And we need to ask ourselves, with every item that's in a museum, did the museum receive permission from the person or their immediate community or ancestors to have this item in the museum? And if not, then it's the museum's responsibility to find a solution on a case-by-case basis, in consultation with as many possible descendants as possible. So what we did at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is, when we got to the point where we'd returned all of the easy, so-called easy connections we could make between groups, we were left with about 20 Native American remains that we knew were Native American, but that was it. We had no sense at all of, which tribe of the 706 at the time, 764 federally recognized tribes, which group it might be connected to. So what we did was we actually tried to consult with all 764 tribes. We sent letters and emails and made calls to every single tribe in the whole country, and as well as Native Hawaiian groups and groups up in Alaska.
Wow.
And we tried to get permission from everybody to figure out what to do. And what happened was a local tribe to Colorado, the Ute Mountain Ute, courageously stepped forward to take responsibility for those remains and offered to bury them in a natural cemetery. And no tribe in the country objected to that plan. So, it's years of work. It was very difficult to try to reach all these tribes. But we felt the museum was complicit in these colonialist appropriations. And so it was the museum's obligation to try to find solutions. So, that's not going to be the solution for every case, but that's an example of how we at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science did our best to try to take that responsibility seriously and to try to find solutions that would work for the institution, for our community, and most importantly, for our tribal partners.
Yeah. Do you feel like you've turned a corner in the museum community where this is just accepted truth, that we have these things that we didn't get through the means that we should, and that we have to do this? Like, what's the sense of urgency, I guess, around that?
I'm, in the end, very optimistic, because you can look back now and see how far museums and the scientific fields in these areas have come. When prior to the passage of this law in 1990, every single major archaeological organization, every single major museum organization fought this law. They did not want it to happen. And finally, they conceded it was going to happen. So then they tried to water it down. Then the law happens, and you have all kinds of scientists and museums saying, we're not going to do this. This is going to be the end of science. This is going to be the end of museums. We can't make this work. And then lo and behold, when museums started returning things, they actually learned tribes weren't trying to, end science. They weren't trying to close museums. They just wanted the stolen stuff back, and they wanted their ancestors respected. And partnerships formed, collaborations formed. And slowly, people began to see the many positives that result from this justice work. And so now, 34 years later, you still find some corners of the field, some museum professionals, some scientists remain staunchly anti-repatriation. But for the most part, most museum professionals see this as a positive obligation. This is something that we have the opportunity to do something right. We have the opportunity in our generation to create a form of justice that betters museums because they learn about themselves. They build stronger collections by having ethically grounded collections. And it's doing something right for Native communities who often talk about the ways in which the return of their ancestors and belongings brings peace. It allows them to acknowledge these forms of violence that they have suffered through and endured. And so for them, these repatriations are very much a form of survival.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk just a little about the scientist in you and the need for scientists to be able to study things like anthropology and all kinds of other things that you get from these kinds of items. Obviously, you think very differently about the process of that work now, but it seems to me that you still need access to these kinds of things in order to do that work. And that access depends, at least at this point, on trust between your community and these Native communities. Do you feel like that trust is possible? Is it being built by this repatriation activity, or are the Native tribes just? I mean, I think I would just be angry. Yeah. I'm not sure I would trust if this were me.
I view this question largely around the first priority is for us to acknowledge the past, because how can we have a future together, working together, one built on trust and mutual respect, if we haven't addressed the past, if we haven't figured out what are the legacies of these harms and how can we set things right? But once you do that and you begin to have these conversations with Native communities, more often than not, what you learn as someone who's had many of these conversations is Native peoples in this country are not anti-science. They are not even anti-museums. There's hundreds of museums in tribal communities themselves. What they are against is a form of science that is extractive and done in a way that violates their rights and dignity as human beings. And so when you go to a community and you've set things right as much as you can in the past, and you ask, okay, are there questions about your own history and heritage you would like to learn? What are the questions you have? What you discover is that these are scientific questions
they're interested too.
Community members have, and they want to learn too. And so another part of my work is based on this collaborative model where you go into communities and build scientific studies together. And it's done in a way that is grounded in mutual respect and mutual responsibility and mutual accountability. And so it's not extractive. And what you learn is even Native peoples themselves are often, Native communities often will sanction the study of their ancestors' remains in particular forms or particular ways, including things like ancient DNA research and looking at diets and skeletal, non-destructive skeletal analyses. But it's done in partnership. It's done with consent. It's done because you're not selfishly answering your own questions, as a scientist, but you're also enabling and empowering community members to ask and answer questions as well. And so that is the future of archaeology. That is the future of museums, one that is fundamentally shaped by mutual respect and a sincere commitment to collaboration.
Yeah. Okay. Chip Colwell, it was really great to have you here to talk about this issue and hear your story, your journey in this space. Great to have you here on Created Equal. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it as well.
That'll do it for this edition of Created Equal. Remember, you can listen to recent episodes of the show at WDET.org. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like what you hear from our WDET programming, please support the station. We are always taking donations. And to do that, you just head over to our website and click the donate button at the very top of the page. Created Equal is produced by Carrie Jr. II and David Lines. Our audio editing is by Connor Anderson, and the music is by Sam Bovian. Created Equal is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University.